Strategic Communications and Marketing Department. I know lots of you guys have been on the other side of my voice recorder as I interviewed you in my last year and a half on campus. In addition to that, though, I'm also in grad school for strategic communication at the University of Oregon, and as part of that, one of my research projects has been Generation Z, and so that is why I know all this stuff about those guys. And they are going to be a particularly interesting group. They're already in our classrooms, but there are more on the way, and so we're going to kind of go through that. I think I'll do the disclaimer about generations and how it's not really fair to paint huge populations with a really broad brush. And that is true. Even the research that I've done about Gen Z, as we're tracking trends and tendencies, it's more like 75 to 85% of people have this preference or indicate that they prefer this, but that still leaves 25% who feel a completely different way. So my coworker Kent yesterday was telling me he's a millennial technically, but he doesn't fall into any of those categories. So just take all of this with a grain of salt. We're just kind of talking about broad strokes. Okay? All right. So I've already just noticed that I've got sort of an itchy trigger finger here. So if I start going through slides, just forgive me. This is just a great quote from George Orwell about how everyone thinks their generation is better than the one before or after it. I'm a Gen Xer, so I know that's true. Okay, so we are going to start with just kind of getting situated in the generational outlook. Now again, I don't remember people being quite as fixated on generational trends when I was growing up. To me, it seemed like that whole thing started with millennials, where they just were hyper studied, and I think that was mostly for marketing and advertising purposes. I'm sure this is not a new theory. I'm sure people have been trying to pigeonhole generations into boxes for years, but I never noticed it. So I want to just do a quick recap on where people are. So greatest generation, those are your World War II kind of generation. They have, all of these generations have lots of different names, but that's where we get started at the turn of that century. The silent generation, much like Gen X, kind of a shoehorn generation in the middle there, not a huge population. That was Depression years, things like that. Then we get to the baby boomers, right? Very famously, a very large group. Those are the people who are going into retirement now. The aging population that, as that group is dying off, for a lack of a better term. Some of the other larger generations that came after it are following. Gen X, you've got my group up there. Those are the sort of the 80s kids who grew up in the 80s before internet. Computers were a thing, but really, I know I got a computer when I graduated high school in 1990, and it was like, the size of a room, and it looked like the screen from War Games. And then millennials, the group that we know tons and tons about. So just a quick poll. How many boomers do we have in the room? A couple of boomers. All right. How about Gen Xers? Nice, my people. And millennials? All right. Good group of those too. Okay, so let's just define Generation Z. We're going to start with the years they were born, 95 to 2010. That puts them, as you can see, way too young for us to be interested in them yet, but also already in our classrooms and are, really importantly, our prospective students, right? So these are the people we want to get onto our campus. They are actually a larger population than millennials were. It's a little bit surprising. And by 2020, or so only 2 years from now, they're going to account for 40% of consumers. Although we never like to think of ourselves as sort of being a business with customers at the university, ultimately that does color a little bit of what we do. And they are also a very diverse generation. In addition to immigrants and just the minority populations we already had, we have with the growing acceptance of mixed race couples, obviously more and more of those. So a lot of people have a tendency to call Gen Z millennials on steroids. I'm sure you guys have probably heard that before. And that's actually really not the case. They share much more with the silent generation than they do with millennials, which is really interesting. If you kind of look at the different circumstances in which they grew up, you'll see a lot of similarities there that make this a much more logical comparison than millennials. They do share some traits with millennials just as a sort of a continuance of preferences and the way the world works. That's what they're accustomed to. But really, as far as a disposition goes, they're much more like the silent generation. Okay, so we are going to dig into preferences. So, of course, Gen Z is known for being tech savvy. I know we see this every day in all of our, whether they're in the classroom or we're working with them as staff members. The difference between millennials and Gen Z, as far as tech goes, is that millennials, for the most part, grew up with tech, but they had to learn the tech. Gen Z, it was already there. They've been playing with iPads since they were 1.5, sadly. So that is just the natural way that they go. It's not something that they have to learn. They just picked it up. They're on multiple screens. Their preferred types of social media are Instagram, Snapchat, and Whisper, which Whisper is actually making I looked at it yesterday because I didn't know much about it, and it's actually making a bit of a surge. Now, I know my coworker Lisa will argue and say there are plenty of prospective students on Facebook as well. That is also true, but as far as what they're on the most, they may check Facebook a couple of times a day, one time a day, but as far as just all the time, that's going to be your Instagram and Snapchat. Privacy issues are an interesting thing. They are aware that privacy is a thing. They should be careful about what they're putting out there onto the internet, but they're not necessarily that worried about it. I know we see a lot of things, advice for kids if they're going to be trying to get a job in the future. Be careful what you put online because your future employers can see all of that stuff. Again, they're aware of it, just I think they think everything is already out there and already accessible anyway, so what's the harm? And of course, I don't know if anybody else in their family has teenagers like I do. They have cut the cord for cable, right? And it's all YouTube, Hulu, all of those things all the time. Okay, at home, again, raised by us Gen Xers, we tend to be a little overly cautious. We're not quite helicopter parents like the millennials seem to be, but we are pretty safety conscious. The kids, and my two teenagers are this quintessentially this. They're homebodies, perfectly happy to stay in their room, much to their parents' chagrin, not spending a lot of time outside playing once they reached a certain age and got phones. But their parents are a significant influence, and that's going to be really important as we